right. Hello everybody. Welcome to our UIUX design workshop for our creative track this winter quarter in ACM Studio. Yay, thank you all for coming. And in this tutorial, we'll be just covering some theory about UIUX and also how to implement it specifically in Unity.
Alrighty, so first, possibly very obvious question, just like what is in general UI UX design? They stand for UI being user interface and UX being user experience. So there's like a lot of similarities, but also differences between the two. You always see the two together. So just we're gonna go into what differentiates them, like what makes them different from one another, but what also makes them similar and how they're related. So in simple terms, user interface is like buttons, menus, cursors, kind of things that you use during navigation. They can be any kind of visual tool that communicates information that the player needs to know. So like health bars, status, like wheels or cursor markers as well. And then UX is user experience, which focuses on kind of like the bigger picture interaction patterns that users have with the structures themselves, like the interaction between the player, user, and the infrastructure that allows game flow. So it's kind of like how those interface aspects are placed and also how the user's experience with them is enhanced. And there's like a fun little like kind of chart, triangle chart at the bottom here, that kind of like shows the different aspects that are each like kind of important towards UX, user experience. So just going to talk about UX, UI, UX in like some more theoretical terms before we get into more concrete stuff, so you guys can like grasp the concept itself before you start applying it. So one important thing in UI UX is information hierarchy and like determining information load. So this is essentially like communicating the most essential aspects of information first, through like thoughtful layout. Also, techniques like color contrast and scale are used to do this. It's kind of like making sure that the person is like the player, the user is getting the information that they need to react to the situation that they're in a timely and like properly prioritized manner. So like if you're fighting a boss, you don't really like care if there's like a resource over there that you need to gather. You care about like what the boss's health status is, stuff like that. But there's also in that consistency, theming, and framing, and that's what these two pictures in the bottom show. It's kind of like you have all these windows and they're all different, but they're in the same game. But if they're not consistent with one another, it can make the playing experience a bit more like create more friction in it. Like you kind of subconsciously expect certain aspects of these windows to be in certain places or look a certain way. And so when they're not, it's kind of jarring, and it makes the user experience like a bit more muddled, not as smooth as it would be with like people like UI UX designers making sure that all that stuff is consistent and learnable. Another part of UI UX that's interesting is the concept of like diegetic UI information. By diegetic, it just means that something that is both in the game space and relative to the game story. So a lot of the times when we think about UI components, we think about things that are just that are not necessarily directly in the game world, you know, like the health bar isn't something that in theory the character is able to see, but it's still information we need. And so this concept of diegetic UI is kind of this new way of thinking about ways to put those kinds of aspects actually in the game world and express them in ways that like even further encourage this feeling of immersion. So you can see on the right, like the player characters kind of like outfit itself, like the things that they are physically wearing, are kind of like showing your health and your status, rather than just kind of like excess information only for the player. It becomes diegetic by being relative to the character in the game world as well. And then another aspect of it that kind of like connects everything is just the idea of user flow, and like the basically the flow of the player's journey through collecting this information. And just in general, we want to mention that the way that a lot of this is kind of prototyped, planned out, is through flowcharts. It makes sense because they're kind of like, they function like that, you know, like you can see on the bottom left image, you click a pause menu, then you have all these options. Let's say you click load game, it brings you to the load list and the load state. And so putting it in these flowchart formats makes it easier to plan out that kind of stuff in prototype, and also like kind of give the structured information to whoever you're giving it to like design it or implement it, stuff like that. And then we have like 3 really helpful websites for actually doing those things. This picture on the bottom right is from Lucidchart. Next, we're going to just talk about like how you use UI and UX, or how it is used to develop an intuitive player experience. Because in the end, that's pretty much UI UX's like main goal, right? Is to make the player understand what's happening and be able to fluidly move through the game. So one of the most important features is affordances and signifiers, and they're pretty much always together. So here they are together. Affordances are essentially like an action that is tied to or facilitated through a certain game object or a certain thing in the game. So like an example is like you click a button, that button opens a door. So that motion of the door opening is kind of like the affordance of that game object, which was the button. Whereas signifiers indicate to the user where and how to perform that action in order to get the affordance to occur. So like the button itself affords navigation to setting, but the visual design and depth of the button signifies that it would allow you to do so. So like if like the button that you pressed to open that door wasn't labeled, it wouldn't have a signifier, which would make it more difficult for you to access that affordance, and therefore more difficult to experience the play of the game, essentially. And feedback is also very important. So feedback can be in multiple forms. It can be visual, like on a loading screen. You want to make sure that your game just hasn't completely crashed. So we tend to have those like moving loading images, and audio feedback, like when you hit an enemy, them kind of responding in turn, and haptic, which is kind of like more sensory, like controller rumbles, or if you're playing like VR or something, like replicated pressure. All of those things are forms of feedback, and feedback is very important because it lets the player know that what they are doing is making a difference, that their input has been received by the system and is making a difference. If there is no feedback, players tend to feel like they aren't making progress and kind of like lose their patience in those kinds of situations. They end up like button smashing, like looking, waiting for something to happen. And in general, feedback is also important just to enhance like the good feel of the game. Like if you're playing a game and you hit enemies, nothing really happens. There's no like little damage effect, no sounds. It just kind of can get flat. So feedback can also just give the game itself some more depth and feel to it. And so all of those aspects kind of go towards building discoverability, which in itself is a component of learnability, like I touched on earlier. And discoverability is really kind of like this big overarching goal in UI UX that's like the ease of which players can find these necessary features, and therefore like pick up on the workings of the system and be able to apply what they learned in those situations in the future. So UI design specifically will make the interface easy to understand what objects can like what can afford them, what actions, like we mentioned with affordances, like the functions that the objects have. And then UX design will kind of like make the navigation through those features more intuitive through a smooth play experience. So it's like intuitive movement for intuitive action is essentially what UI's overarching purpose is.
All right. Now that we've heard more about like the theoretical underpinnings and information about UI UX, we can now move on to actually applying that in Unity. So this part of the tutorial is more about implementation in Unity and introducing kind of the Unity components and things like that you can use. And to demonstrate that, we will be making a very kind of rough main menu. And main menus in games are usually the first thing that you see in a game. And so, for example, we have pictures here of Into the Breach in Minecraft. Their main menus show up as soon as you open the game. And it often includes elements such as the game's title, the play button or new game and continue, or in the case of Minecraft, it's single player and multiplayer. And also the settings for people to change, say, their controls or how everything is shown in the game, or in the quick game button to leave the game, and credits and anything else that you will need on the main menu for people to see initially. Moving on to that, we can begin by making our main menu and introducing our Unity UI components. So if you haven't, you can just download our Unity package that we posted in our Discord announcements, and you can also find it in our GitHub. Let me post that here as well. For our main menu section, we will be covering the UI components, buttons, text, and images. Those are kind of like the basis of a lot of like UI design. I think like when I initially started, those were the only things I used. And following that, we will also try to cover like kind of a settings menu, under which you can also include components such as toggles, masks, or scroll rects, scroll bars, and things like that. And don't worry if you don't understand that right now, we can cover that as we go. Okay, so now you can open up Unity. This is what it'll look like if you downloaded the skeleton package. We have like 2 small files here that is actually optional. So if you haven't downloaded the skeleton package, don't worry. We can get started with an empty Unity project as well. And if you don't have it downloaded, it's okay as well. Yeah, so we can start with an empty project as well. So what we're going to do first is like introduce just what to do when you want to start with UI. So once you open this, you'll see like something similar to this. And if you don't, you can also like check out layouts too, and click default to have, oh, sorry, it closed the window. But if you click default, it can show up as like what we'll have here. It's just basically like an empty display for what Unity is like. And to begin doing UI, we'll click on the hierarchy over here on the left. The hierarchy basically shows all the elements you currently have in the game, and UI is also kind of a game object. So right click and go to UI. And we can add a canvas. Yeah, and let me rename the canvas so that we know what it is. Yay. So canvases are basically where all your UI components will be drawn to. So for example, if you have a button, you will need a canvas for it to show up. It's almost like in art, you have a canvas for your art things to show, to be put onto, basically. And to add, let's begin with an image component. So if you go down to UI and click image, you'll have a little white square in the center right here. Also, let me know if I'm going too quickly or too slowly, yeah, in the chat. So has everyone been able to kind of navigate here to create a canvas and also make an image? Okay. All right. Okay, thank you. So now that we have this little like white box in the center, that is basically where we can put display our images to. So if you look here on the right, this shows all the components each game object has. So a game object is like one of these things that show up in the hierarchy, and a component is just they determine what the game object can do. And if you add an image, this will have some like default components with it. And what makes an image is the image component that it has over here. Yeah. And to display things to it, you will drag images to the source image slot over here. So we can first look at this little white box and notice that there are some like little triangles. And these triangles are basically are called their anchors. And the anchors just determine how the box would shift and stay when your game window changes. So here, if we have all the little triangles and anchors in the center, if we change the game window, it will stay in the center. But this little image that we have here, we can intend it to be a background. So we would want it to shift according to how the game window, the entirety of the game window would be. And to do that, you will navigate to the rect transform component to the right here, and then click on this box. This basically shows your anchor presets. So that's Unity has some default kind of presets that you can use to help simplify your workload. So if you don't use presets, you can actually like drag these directly to kind of set. Yeah, and as you can see by editing the anchor, it is changing how the box is kind of just reacting to the scene. And as mentioned before, we would like it to be the background. So we would use this preset here that Unity has created for us. And a quick way of setting the shape of the image while you're also setting the anchor is by clicking this and then also pressing Alt. This will set the image to fill the entirety of the screen, the canvas, yeah, or its parent right now. Does that make sense? Let me know. Has everyone been able to kind of fill the canvas with this image by setting its anchors and its shape? Yeah, so you basically go to rect transform, click on this, hold Alt, and then press on the bottom right option. Okay, now we have done that. We can begin setting what our image should be. So you can use whatever image. In our package, we have this little landscape image that you can put in. So you can drag it in here into the source image slot, and it'll set the image to what the image here is. Yeah. So in the image component, you can also look at the other little settings here. Something that you might use is the color setting. So by adjusting this, you can adjust how like the entirety of the image will be colored. So maybe we can have it look a little like a nighttime landscape or something by adjusting it to a darker purple or blue. Yeah, and so you can use that as a little setting as well if you want to make it look funkier. And another thing that I want to point you guys to is like this setting here from the game window. So right now it's set to free aspect. So that means like whatever this window is, it'll, scale accordingly. But usually we want to make sure that we can expect what the kind of aspect ratio of the game will be. So often we just set it to full HD 1920 by 1080 and we just keep it that way. And if you set it that way, it'll keep its aspect ratio. Yeah. And speaking of kind of scaling, let's first begin with a button. Okay, now that we've talked about the image, if you move down to UI and go to button, make sure that you make a button that is Text Mesh Pro, because Text Mesh Pro is just superior to Unity normal text. And what it does is basically it keeps all the text like looking crisp and fresh, no matter how big you scale them. And often like built in like kind of Unity text is very blurry if you have something very big. And it also offers a lot more kind of customizability. So yeah, use TMP when you can, and don't be afraid of the import step. So just click on it. Okay, yeah. So if you try to create a button with Text Mesh Pro, this will pop up and you just click on Import TMP Essentials and it will import it for you. Okay, and once you've done that, you can access the magic of Text Mesh Pro. And now we have added a button to our canvas. And a button is basically just a button. So the things that you can click on a menu and things like that. Like we mentioned before, main menus usually have a start button, and this can be, we can scale this and edit it to be our kind of start button placeholder here. Yeah, and it's kind of tiny relative to the screen. So you can click on this kind of scaling tool here, or I think it's S. I'm not very sure about the shortcut, but you can click on that and then press the little square in the button to scale it kind of uniformly to make it big. And now it's a very big button. Okay, and as you can see, the button text is very crisp, very pretty, no matter how big you make it. As opposed to say, if we used a UI and a normal button. Let me just put this here as like a demonstration. And this is using the normal text. If you scale it up, it's kind of ugly. Sorry, Unity text, but yes, use Text Mesh Pro. Now that we have this, it's a button, and you can edit it by opening it here in the hierarchy and clicking on the text. And in the text here, you can locate the Text Mesh Pro component on the right and edit whatever you want in the text input kind of window. So we're thinking about making a start button. So let me type in start. It's that easy, yay. And with Text Mesh Pro, you can have a lot of different kind of formats and things like that. So you can make it bold, you can make it italicized, underlined, strike through, or lowercase, or all caps, and also small caps. So very fancy, a lot of different things that you can do with it. And you can also use auto size. Maybe let's not demonstrate it with a button, but basically what it does is like according to the size of your object, it will scale your text according to how big that box is. Yes, and the vertex color here is basically the text color. And if you click on it, it will open this color window again, and you can choose colors and also just choose it from, the color wheel or edit it from here. Yeah. Yeah, and there's actually a lot more to explore, but we're going to move on to the next thing. So as mentioned here, the text on the text button, the button, there's a text game object, and you can also just add plain old text, not plain old text, Text Mesh Pro text to the main menu for us to display some nice text. So I'm going to name this title, and using the scaling tool again, I'm going to make it really big. And maybe move it to the top here. That's very big, but that's okay. So if you move it to the top, and here we can talk about auto size. So if we if you click on auto size over here on the right side, if you change the text box, it will size the text accordingly. Apparently it's a little costly on the engine, but if you, I don't know, it's a nice function to have. Yeah, and here you can determine the minimum and the maximum of the text. So if you don't want it to get too small, it won't get too small. So if I scale it to that big, it will stay minimum 18. I can make it 5 or 1 so that I can go even smaller. But yeah, and you can also do max. So if I make that bigger, it can go to a bigger text. Yeah. But yeah, so some more settings here. And as how we edited the button, you can edit the text for the title. What should we name this? Axolotl. Okay. That's where you're gonna name it. And yeah, you can name your title, whatever. But yeah, you can put it here. So that's kind of a basic intro to just images in the background, text in Text Mesh Pro as Text Mesh Pro, and a button. Okay, and now we can move on to creating maybe a settings menu, a little outline for a settings menu. I can share my screen and share the slide to kind of connect what we have here just by manipulating the UI game objects to maybe coding. If you go to the button and look at its button component this time, you can use this onClick function to call different types of things that you want it to do. So onClick, you can make it open a menu, open a quit game, or I don't know, change the color of the title or something according to what you want. And also notice oh, I forgot to cover this, but in the button, there's also a transition that you can do. So right now, if I press play, if I go onto it and click, it does that. And you can edit what that does by using, by clicking on this drop-down menu and kind of switching the type of navigation it does. So you can also do animations for it or a sprite swap. So we have some default sprites here that you can use for this. So if you go into assets and open this, maybe you can drag some pictures here into, let's see. So first of all, let's go to image that's what it normally displays. So in the game, oh, that's a little weird. I think the scaling was off. Anyways, let's okay, we can just go forward with this as like demonstrating how the transition works. But basically, if you do that and edit the highlighted sprite here, press sprite, selected sprite, and disabled sprite. So if I use this on the highlighted sprite, and then this as the press sprite, so I'm just dragging from these, it'll change how it looks. So let me also drag that in. Okay. Yes. So now that you're using Sprite Swap, it'll look different when you try to select it. Okay. So it looks like that now. And when you click, it does that. And it also does that because your navigation is set to automatic. So if you don't want it to do that, you can click that. And I think that fixes it. So now it doesn't stay pressed. Oh, like, yeah, not mad, but like, you know. Okay. All right. Now that we've covered kind of the details about buttons as well, we can move on to talking about more some other very cool UI components that you can use. So here's like an example of like an options menu that a lot of games have. So you can often use it to change the resolution of the game, the quality, the volume, and things like that. And also accessibility settings if you would like to put them in, and please do, because they're very important. And Unity has some built-in kind of game objects that you can use to make these kind of sliders and drop-down menus. And we can explore them together here. Okay, yeah. Let me switch back to my Unity. Oh, I also forgot to cover like kind of canvas settings really quickly. I think Ray will talk more about this. But like right now, if you set it to like free aspect, it might do like weird things like that. And normally we don't want that to happen. So I think if you change this, oh, not that, if you change the canvas scaler here, the canvas scaler component on the canvas to scale with screen size and set the reference resolution to what we currently have, it will look nice. So if you do free aspect, it'll stay like kind of according to what we initially made. Yeah. So this is under the canvas, so the component that we made at the very beginning, and then canvas scaler, scale with screen size, and then you set the reference resolution to your kind of target resolution. Okay, we can finally move on to settings. Okay. Okay. All right, and as a rule of thumb, you can make as many like canvases as you need, and usually you will make a canvas every time you have like a new kind of function and group. So right now we're talking about settings, so we can make another canvas for that. Yay! So settings menu. Let's make something called a panel in here. Oh, and as you can see, it's not showing up. Why is that? That is a mystery, but actually, if you go to settings menu and look at the right over here, under the canvas component, there's a sort order. And the sort order basically determines like the order of how things are drawn to the screen. And because it is currently 0, it's kind of overlapping with the main menu. But if you want it to be above the main menu, you will add to the sort order. So like if the sort order is bigger than something, it will be above it. If it's like smaller, so like -1, it will be below it. So now you'll put say like 1 here. Okay, and let me delete the panel and let you show you what it looks like when I add it. So when I make a panel, it looks like that. So I'm just going to name that settings panel. And a panel is basically just a special image with some kind of default settings. And you can kind of just treat it like a built-in panel made for you because it kind of has its own little style going on. And when you add it, it automatically sets its anchors to the edges of the screen and has its own kind of source image here. So it has like rounded corners and is half transparent. And you can edit its transparency here under color, under A, which is alpha. And by turning it up, you can make it more opaque or more transparent as needed. Yes. Now that we're talking about like the settings menu, maybe we want to learn more about how to kind of turn these canvases on and off, because we don't want players to see all of them at the same time. As mentioned before, like that's probably not very good for UX. So how to do that? So a way of turning things on and off is, so turning like canvases on and off is just by disabling or enabling the canvas component here. By disabling that, you can disable what is drawn to the screen. So without a canvas, the panels, buttons, and things like that can't be drawn. And by doing that, you can disable the not game object, like the canvas, and so users can't see them anymore. Another thing that people do is they might disable the entire game object with this checkbox. But if you're just disabling like the canvas, it's better for like performance and things like that, because it kind of saves what it has already drawn. And yeah, so it doesn't take more kind of computer energy for it to redraw them. Okay, now that we're here, yeah, okay, so kind of about like Richard's question, we can talk a little bit about raycasting. And basically raycasting is like whether something on screen can register your clicks, right? So for example, right now I have the settings panel on. Move this away. And if I click around here, it wouldn't register because the panel is taking my mouse clicks and just blocking it. And I think that's what we normally want. But say, let's see. I'm not sure if it'll like continue to block it if I disable the canvas. Oh, tell me each time. Oh, it doesn't. So yeah, so that is a good solution. But like something that is kind of annoying for the computer to like chug through is like the raycasting. So if something doesn't need to have like your mouse, like if something doesn't need to know that your mouse is clicking it, you don't need to have the raycast setting on. So it would be like here. It wouldn't, you can turn that off, like it doesn't have to be a raycast target. Yeah, unless it needs to block things as well. But yeah, so say like this image, this background image here, you can turn off the raycast target to save some computer performance. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if that answers Richard's question at all, but I don't know if I have like the full answer. So Richard, feel free to elaborate on that as well. I'm not sure about lerping through alpha value. I think, so sometimes people like try to turn canvases off by changing the transparency here. But I think from what I've heard is like that's not very efficient. But correct me if I'm wrong. Yes. Okay. Alrighty. So some other canvas group component. Oh, to fade the transparency of the entire canvas. Okay, interesting. Wait, we can look at the canvas group. Oh, there we go. Yes, so from here you can change its alpha as well and make it like whether it's interactable or block raycasts and things like that. Yeah. So if you would like to use that, canvas groups are also a very cool component that you can use. Thank you, Richard, for the contribution. And fade the transparency of the entire canvas. Yeah. So, and I think like if you want, like that might give you some very cool like visuals as well by fading through the alpha. Yeah, and you can disable or enable its interactivity and whether it blocks kind of raycasts or your like mouse clicking. Okay, so Athena adds that messing with the alpha value of a panel might screw with the raycast blocking of the panel. Oh, so raycasting also checks for the transparency, so the alpha or the transparency of a game object. Okay. Alrighty. So some other UI components or game objects that you can just add are, as mentioned before, right now we're trying to make a settings menu. One thing that is really cool is a slider. Say if you want to set volumes, well, volume settings or text speed, text size, or things like that. You can have a slider component that like people interact with and stores the value that people input. Yeah, I'm doing the little scaling thing again to make it really big. So here's a slider. It is very nice. If you click play, it currently, oh, that way. If you click play, right now you can like already interact with it. So it does, it slides. And if you look into the slider component, you can see more details on what it is doing specifically. So here on the right-hand side, you can change the direction of the slider. So you can decide on whether you want it to be left to right or right to left or bottom to top or top to bottom. And by changing that, it just kind of changes the orientation of the slider. And there's also the min value and the max value. Oh, question. Okay, Richard says, if he recalls correctly, you can actually change the minimum alpha value for raycast on images through code. So consider that. Oh, and here we have the min and max values under the slider, and it just kind of determines like what the each like end. Oh, dang. But yeah, it just kind of determines what each like end of the slider represents. So right now it's 0 to 1. So if you slide it to the left, it's 0. Slide it to the right, it's 1. And everything in between is like something between the two values. Wow. And so you can change that to be like, say, 8 or 88, I guess I typed. And it will go from 0 to 8. Or if you want to do like 3, it will go from 3 to 8. And if you do whole numbers, So here's another setting that says whole numbers. If you click that, it'll just increment by whole number values. So you can snap it to like kind of integers by clicking that. Yes. And I think, yeah. So for me, I usually just keep it as 0 and 1 and use kind of like the decimal or the floats according to C# in between to set the values or get the values. Okay, yes, and say you have volume. Oops, oh my gosh, I'm clicking on the things behind. Let me buy. Okay, so say you have a volume slider, and if people want to mute things, maybe they want to just completely turn off the volume altogether. And what you can do is add a, so trying to find a toggle. Okay, so a toggle, like just by hearing its name, let me see the chat. Okay, yeah. So a toggle is basically a checkbox. And you might have noticed that, oh, let me put it here. You might have noticed that it's like under like UI and then toggle, there isn't a Text Mesh Pro option, unfortunately. So if you like scale it up to fit the screen size, the toggle is going to look very blurry. But it is a very easy fix. Let me move that over. Yeah, you can just click open the toggle here and edit like the label, which is the currently the text that it has, and just add Text Mesh Pro instead. Oh, okay, you have to delete this first. Okay. Text Mesh Pro UI. And you can talk, I don't know, like mute audio. Oh, it's huge. Auto size, yes. Actually, don't auto size. Let's do 18 so that we don't turn on the, add more weight to our computer. Okay, so if you set, yeah, you just have to change the text component under the label to Text Mesh Pro, and then you'll have very pretty looking text. And it's kind of apparent here that like the toggle right now is behind the panel. It's looking a little, you know, not kind of blocked. So you notice that on the left side here under settings menu, toggle is above the settings panel. So that actually means that it is layers wise and how it's drawn, it is drawn behind the settings panel. So you can put it under the settings panel for it to, under the settings panel game object in the hierarchy over here for it to draw above it. Okay, so basically in the hierarchy, whatever is below the other thing, it's drawn above it. I'm not entirely sure. Actually, I think it's because, like, say organization wise, if you want a child to be above the thing, its parent, it's going to be, you know, under it. So, but yeah, just remember that things that are below in the hierarchy is actually drawn above things. Okay, and so here's a toggle. And a toggle is basically a checkbox. If you want things to be either true or false, you can have a toggle. And a toggle basically has a lot of functions under it. If you go to the background here, not function, sorry, kind of like child objects or just things that are below it in the hierarchy, like in its group, you can find its background. So that's like the box over here, and you can change how that looks if you want. Now I made it a knob. And you can change how the check mark looks if you want. If you go to the check mark and change it to, say, a cog, or actually that's very weird, so I'm going to change it back. Okay. So yeah, so those are the things under the toggle. And if you click play, and Unity loads, you can like enable, I don't know, like click it so that it turns on or off. And as you can see here, it has like an is on kind of setting here. You can click it. So whether it's turned on or off determines, you know, it kind of just registers whether it is turned on or off. Yeah. Yeah, and notice here there's also a group thing. So what a toggle group is basically, say you have like a multiple choice thing, and you have two toggles, but you only want one to be able to be toggled on. So you'll put them both into, you'll put them both under a parent, so like toggle group. And if you add a toggle group to this and set their groups to that toggle group here. So you can set that by clicking on the little circle here and selecting, or you can drag it in from there. If you do that, the two kind of toggles will be affected by each other, and only one toggle can be switched on at a time. I'm not very sure. This might be helpful if you want to, say, build like a quiz app or something. But yeah, so that's a cool little function that they have in here as well. So those are called toggle groups. In addition to these, there's also something called an input field. Yes. So we're not going to go into too much detail about like the code side of things here, but just know that like the text message pro input field has these little functions at the bottom that can interact with your code. And what a input field does is, say you want a player to input their name, and you just create an input field and type things into it. Yeah, so I'm going to play to show you what it does. So if you have an input field here, you can say, I'm going to say Faustine, and enter, and then it stores it into on-end edit. Yeah, and you can edit how it looks as well by choosing like selection color. So that's basically, if you saw when I selected my text, it turned blue, you can change that and turn it into a red for, I don't know, for it to look very cool. And you can also change the input field background here as well under the image. As mentioned, images basically just display things to the screen. So you can change that as well into some funky shape or something that you have made yourself. And the text area has like a little mask. So we can talk more about that later, but you can also edit things under here as well. The placeholder is just essentially like what it says before you edit the text. So you can make it say enter text, or you can make it say hello. And then it says hello. Yeah, and you can change what it looks like here as well. It can be italicized, bolded, things like that. And the actual text is what the user will be inputting. So that's key or something. Yeah. Well, it's a little laggy. But yeah, there's that. You can edit all of that if you want to make it fit your aesthetic. And another thing that is a little bit I don't know, like say, like if you have a multiple choice thing or different versions, I don't know, like usually it's like a different aspect ratio for a game. You can have a drop down menu. And if you make that bigger and play, it basically gives you some options that you can choose from and click through. Yeah, so option B, option C. And like all the other ones, the things that are grouped with it are below it. And you can change each thing if you want. And the template here is just like where the options are displayed. And it has a viewport, so what the options are, and a scroll bar, which will scale according to the number of options you put in. Yeah, and you can edit its kind of behaviors over here. So you can edit the options. So if you look to the right and under the dropdown Text Mesh Pro component, you can change the options. So we can change it to like axolotl or studio, gamer. But yeah, so you can change them to display different things as you want as well. And you can explore each little setting in detail. Yeah. Let's see. I think there might be. Let's see. Okay, let me demonstrate that it has changed. And also, if you guys check the chat, you can find a lot of like gold, a gold conversation between Athena and Richard. We can look more into that after these components. But yeah, so I changed each option and you can see it being shown there. Yeah, so that's the drop down menu. And another thing that you might use is a scroll view. This is slightly more complicated. It basically allows for like scrolling things and putting, so you can put things into it, and if you have more than can be displayed on the screen, it'll like, you can scroll to the things that are off screen. Yeah, and in a scroll view, it basically has like a bunch of different components that are available put together already, so you don't have to worry about putting them together. But if you want more flexibility, you can actually kind of just use each component individually. But I'm just introducing this so that for a quick way of making this, you can just use a scroll view. And in a scroll view, it has, you can take a look at its components here. It has a scroll rect. So that's a rectangle that can be scrolled around. In the viewport is basically just where the things will be displayed in. And the scroll bar horizontal is the horizontal scroll bar. The scroll bar vertical is the vertical scroll bar. And you can choose to only have the horizontal or vertical scrolling by changing the settings here. And you can set it in the scroll rect here. So it's like horizontal or vertical. If you only want it to scroll vertically, for example, you can turn off horizontal. Yeah, and it just scales automatically to whatever you have in your content section. So let me show you kind of how to put things into it. So under viewport, you have something called content. And as you can see, it's kind of a long boy. So basically that's where you will put all your kind of information, things like that, that you want to be scrollable in. So say I put my volume slider into it. I just drag it under the content. Or yeah, I'm just gonna put, how about let's put everything into the content. And basically now you have stuff in the content of your scroll view. And you can scroll to view it. So yeah, as you can see, it is now in the scroll view. So yeah, so basically this helps you, like if you want to display more than you can fit in a screen, you can use a scroll view. Some things that might be helpful is, so let me drag these out again. Oops, not there. And I'm going to disable all of them so that they're not like kind of cluttering our view. Okay, we can go in here and say we want to add, let's add some buttons. I'm just going to add a bunch. Oh no, I added a normal button. We need a text mesh pro button. Okay. Okay, I added a bunch just by like copy and pasting. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so they're all in there. And oh, also one thing that might be worth mentioning is that see the viewport. One of the components that it has is a mask. So what masks do is kind of just they make things that are on it like hidden if it's outside of it. There's like a lot more to it, but that is something that it can do. So if you disable the mask, it's going to show the buttons that are supposedly off screen. So make sure you have a mask. And with all of these buttons, you can also actually say you want them to be aligned. That's a lot of pain if you want to do it one by one, but you can use a layout element to do it automatically for you. So say you want to like lay it out like vertically, you can use a vertical layout. Oh, okay, sorry about the time. Yeah, so you can use, yeah, I'll quickly cover this. So if you want to use a vertical layout group, it'll help align everything together for you. You can do middle, center, upper left. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully that's helpful. If you want to put things in an orderly fashion, you can do that. Yeah. Oh, another thing that you can do, one last thing, is, let's see, let me try to find, so number of steps also like determines how many steps that it can scroll through. And the value is like what it currently is at for the scroll bar. Okay. And going to scroll view here, you can also change the scroll sensitivity. So say you want to use your like this to scroll, and changing the scroll sensitivity just changes how much your how sensitive it is to scrolling. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's like kind of the main things that I wanted to cover, and hopefully that was really helpful. And there's actually more that you can look at for canvases and UI. We can wrap it up here for my section. Yeah.
Hello, I'm going to be talking about the canvas render modes in Unity, which you can see here. There are two different render modes. First, I'll give some context about some other stuff, such as the camera in Unity. The camera displays the game to the player, and you can see in the orthographic projection, this lenticular prism is what the camera can see. And the orthographic projection game objects will be like the same scale wherever, but that's not what it's like in real life. So for something like real life, we'd use a perspective projection where things are closer, or bigger, and get smaller as they're further away. And you notice that like the frog kind of clipped out of the screen. That's because you just have the clipping points for the camera. Like right now the frog is said to be shorter than where the frog is, so you wouldn't see the frog anymore. Okay. And another thing is screen space. Screen space is the 2D coordinates of the screen and it's measured in pixels. The coordinates range from 0, 0 in the bottom left to max with max height in the top right. And world space is the 3D coordinates the game exists in. You kind of see it in the 3D scene view here, that everything in the game is like with 3D. It exists in like 3D space, and the coordinates range from negative infinity, negative infinity, negative infinity to infinity, infinity, infinity. The render hierarchy is the order in which things are rendered in Unity. So the game hierarchy, which is just the stuff that exists inside the game, it's always rendered first, and after that, post-processing, and the UI just renders depending on the render mode. Post-processing consists of visual effects and effects applied to the screen after the scene is drawn before it's rendered. So you can see right here, it's applied on post-processing, and you see that the background and the frog change, but not the UI button. That's because, okay, as it is right now, we're in the overlay render mode. So in the overlay render mode, your canvas, continue your UI is placed on the screen. It's like, you can see like in the 3D scene view, it's like really obnoxiously large. The canvas is just like floating there. And it's just like, it doesn't interact with other stuff in the game. Like no matter where you move the frog, it doesn't really like, it doesn't affect the button. And as you already saw, post-processing doesn't affect the button either. Now there's another render mode. Let's try camera. And you can immediately see that the button changed color because it's affected by post-processing now. So, and you also see that instead of a large, like obnoxious large canvas that's like randomly floating around, you see that the canvas is now placed like relative to the camera, and you can change the plane distance between the canvas and the camera here, like stuff like that. Yeah, but you can't move it like using rect transform here. And since the canvas is placed relative to the camera, that means you can place game objects in between the canvas and the camera, like such. Okay. The last render node is world space. So you can see that, like with the camera, the button's affected by post-processing, and also, unlike the camera, you can actually like use rect transform to move the canvas around. Because in the world space render mode, the canvas is basically just another game object. So you can just treat it as such, and it can be affected by in-game systems such as physics. So let's say we have this rigid body to be attached to this button, and you see, oh, it falls, but that's not the case in other render modes. Like let's go back to camera and see only the frog falls, even though the rigid body is still attached. And then back to overlay mode. You see that only the frog falls. I guess some other things. So yeah, it's around. So in overlay mode, notice how only the frog is changing. And then here, we change the field of view in camera, only frog changes as well. Then in world space, both the frog and the button change because the button is now being rendered with the frog. Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's it for the canvas render modes. The Unity documentation for this is pretty nice actually. And if you want to learn more about post-processing, you should definitely check out Athena's tutorial from the fall, which is linked in the GitHub. Thank you for your time.
Why is designing for accessibility important? Why should we, as UI/UX designers in game development, care about accessibility? More specifically, is thinking about, are all these little details really necessary? Is it a waste of effort or too time-consuming to implement? It's important to understand that gaming is an exponentially growing part of our social and entertainment culture. What gaming means to you could just as easily be as meaningful and important to everyone and anyone else too. With more means than ever, it really is time to become more actively aware and actionable in creating a more inclusive community for gamers. In the overall consumer base, the assumption is that players with disabilities tend towards the minority, which often makes designing for accessibility lower on the priority list in comparison to, say, finishing the game. But in reality, a lot of accessibility designs or features help more than just people who consider themselves disabled. For instance, as we age, our physical abilities such as eyesight slowly begin to deteriorate with us as well. Or even thinking about temporary impairments that can occur at any point in time, such as an unideal playing environment, such as the place being too bright, too dark, the surrounding environment being too noisy. The key takeaway here is recognizing accessibility affects so many more than what we might think. Here's another core question to consider. Does a game have to be challenging in order to be rewarding? A sort of thought experiment. What is the difference between difficulty and inaccessibility? The core idea of accessibility is to provide as many players as possible the best opportunity to fully and completely experience the game. Through UI/UX, the overarching goal is to design an experience and interface of a game to be easy to understand, intuitive, and streamline the whole gaming process. By doing this, a designer isn't necessarily changing certain mechanics of the game. Similarly, to make it accessible is not to change how the game is played. If anything, accessibility focuses on outside factors or specific design elements unrelated to the core gameplay that prevents a person from playing the game. On the other hand, the idea of difficulty or difficulty levels in a game centers around how playable the core game mechanics themselves are. In other words, you can have this really good core gameplay with, say, different difficulty levels. But if the UI is really bad in a way where the player can't find certain buttons in the game to do a certain task, or say if they don't know what XYZ components on the screen does, this is an example of inaccessibility and not quote unquote gameplay difficulty. Before I get into a couple of universal sort of actions or elements you can implement in your game to make it more accessible, I want to give a sort of disclaimer. The approach for accessibility is different for different game genres, for different game mechanics. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. There's no standard implementation practice. There's no universal checklist of A, B, C that we as UI UX designers should follow in order to automatically make a game accessible for everyone. In order to address accessibility in game design on this sort of necessary case-by-case basis, it's important to understand what different handicaps someone may have and what exactly are the obstacles for someone with them that may occur when trying to play your game. As of now, we'll cover two more common accessibility accommodations. The first one focuses on vision. A lot of time in UI, different contrasting colors are used in order to distinguish different things, such as situations, screen items, actions, and so on and so forth. The problem with using color as the sole point of differentiation is that for, say, colorblind people, it becomes difficult or even impossible to distinguish certain elements in the game. And well, if an element is connected to being able to play a certain core part of the game becomes inaccessible to those people. One way to address this concern is by actively thinking of ways to differentiate elements in the game with other design aspects, in addition to color. For example, using different shapes, text identifiers, or other similar signifiers. The goal should always be to ensure that no essential information is conveyed by a fixed color alone. The second major handicap I want to cover is with hearing. A lot of games may have audio rather than visual cues to convey important information, such as tonal changes in music, voice dialogue, and even sound effects. Again, like with what we addressed before, the goal we want to keep in mind is to design components in the game or components of a game in a way where information is not disseminated through one specific, say, visual or audio cue alone. And while audio may not necessarily fall under UI UX, it is important to consider working with other developers on the team in terms of finding working solutions for accessibility. In this case, implementing subtitles could be a solution. And even in this solution alone, you may also want to consider allowing users to, say, adjusting contrast for which they can see subtitles, and even the text size of the subtitles. Another component to consider designing is allowing for the user to manually adjust the volume of different audio components, such as music, sound effects, or dialogue. These are two very basic, but also quite important things you consider when designing for accessibility. If you want to know more in depth about what you can do in UI UX to make a game more accessible, since I know there's just so much to cover, and we only talked about this for a few minutes and clearly didn't cover everything, you can click on the link you see here, or you can also just simply look up game accessibility guidelines. Should be the first link. And you will be given this incredibly compiled list of ways or things to think about when making your game more accessible. It's a live document, so it's constantly being updated with new ideas and